Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome once again. And I'm really excited to welcome Elizabeth Threlkeld from the Stimson Center. Elizabeth has spent many years studying, analyzing, and assessing the South Asia region. She understands vast parts of the world. Elizabeth, welcome. And I just want to dive right in, if that's okay. I mean, I think people know who you are, and I could spend a few minutes talking about all the amazing work that you and your colleagues do at the Stimson Center, including, curate some really fantastic South Asian talent. Do you see what the Trump administration seems to be committed to doing here, which is essentially dismantling its relationship with Europe as it currently is formulated around security, and dismantling the notion of tech and AI for good and kind of global norms and global governance, and basically saying my way or the highway? It's definitely a thing to try to do, and it feels like it's historic and that it's the end of something and the beginning of something new. Am I being too dramatic?
It is, I think, a question that many of us are contemplating right now. I think I will probably disappoint you to an extent, because my answer, to be honest, is it feels like it is genuinely too soon to tell. I have heard some people far smarter than myself who follow issues in Europe and the transatlantic partnership more closely than I do say, at the seed of this, at the crux of this, is wanting to urge Europe to take its own security responsibilities more seriously. And that as part of those negotiations comes some bluster, comes some of this rhetoric. There are others who say this is something that's more transformational. And I think that is likely to come into focus, especially as they see, what negotiations are going to be taking place in Saudi Arabia this week, for example. Obviously, this is deeply implicated in the Ukraine context, how that is going to play out at the negotiating table. There are real meaningful questions here. And of course, our program does a lot more on South Asia, on the Indo-Pacific, and so that's the part of the world that I tend to think about more. But with that context, it's not just Europe, right? These are long-standing security commitments. You think of extended deterrence, the guarantees that go along with many of those responsibilities the U.S. has taken on in concert with its allies over the course of the last 70 plus years. And so I think it raises some really significant questions that will have impacts far outside of Europe. But I genuinely think that right now, I could not tell you what this actually means. And I do think that, as frustrating as that could be, it's also important to just have a little bit of humility at a time like this, where it really does feel like, taking a moment, catching our breaths, and trying as best we can to gauge which way things are headed. And recognizing that, yes, this is a live conversation in the US, but of course, sitting here in Pakistan today, not just in Pakistan, but around the world, countries are trying to understand and trying to calibrate. And so there's going to be not just what the US ends up doing, but what those second order impacts and third order impacts of that uncertainty are in this broader system. My sense is, there's likely to be some soul searching. There's likely to be a bit of a scramble to understand the implications, and for each individual country to think about its own security interests in this new context, as we all try to wayfind and figure out what that might look like meaningfully going forward.
One thing you said that really struck at me, and of course I want to talk about the big picture, but in some ways, Elizabeth, you've already kind of, headed that off by saying, I guess we have to wait and see. And I think that's absolutely, I think that's accurate. Like, I think it would be, I asked the question if I was being too dramatic. I definitely think the economists and the FT, and I think the Western press is a little prone to drama. Partly, I think, because if you don't do it, you don't get the views and clicks. Yeah. Luckily, we don't have to care about that in this conversation. I think it would be hard to imagine less than a 99% positive response in Washington and I guess the DMV area. Is that what it's the? Yeah. Am I wrong about that?
I think there's shades of versions of
Sure.
that, right?
Yeah.
And it is, to an extent, something that we've seen, like, this is not just coming from this moment, right? Like, this has been a long time coming in some ways. And
I think
maybe
since 1990,
right?
essentially, no?
And so if you pull back from that, if you look at that, there are questions to be asked that are being asked in DC and elsewhere in terms of what that actually means on paper. And Europe is, I think, to an extent, galvanized by this right now, right? We've seen quite a bit of intention and concern, but there are some real challenges in that space as well. And so when we have Zelensky saying, there needs to be a European army as one version of this, I think others would probably take a slightly less maximalist position there. But
Well, because it's not others' country that's being sort of, consumed by Russian sort of mortar shells.
But, we've seen in Ukraine, we've seen the meaningful example of how this is real, how this is immediate for Europe. And I think thinking about the counterfactual of, had the US been less committed than it was over the course of the last coming up on 4 years now in Ukraine, if I'm not wrong. 3 years in Ukraine. So how might that have impacted the war effort, right? Like, what does US credibility, what does the really significant investments the US has made on behalf of Ukraine's defense forces, even as we look at the situation in the war perhaps moving to more of a phase of negotiations, getting here at all required quite a bit. And it required quite a bit of negotiation. We saw a lot of coming together. I think the Biden administration did a really admirable job of navigating a lot of that. And
but a lot of what Biden was doing, from my vantage point, was essentially a different version and a much more civil and kind version of what Trump is doing and what essentially you said, which is, hey, Europe should take more responsibility for security. I think it's ridiculous that, everybody stands up for Russia in the way that the West did and finances it to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. Then those same friends get on planes, land in Pakistan, and remind us of like 600 million under Kerry Lugar that came through a couple of years, presented us 40 billion, which was over 70 years, and ask us not to take 40 billion, which was over 4 or 5 years from CPEC, to build our roads and our energy infrastructure. Meanwhile, not addressing any of our actual legitimate security needs, while India is constantly claiming Pakistani territory and physically attacking Pakistan as it did in February of 2019. It's a hard dichotomy to digest for me, even though, sadly, I think a lot of Pakistanis have just kind of bought it hook, line, and sinker that these are the wages of being a poorer middle power than what it should be.
I think there are a few places in that parallel where it doesn't immediately map on for me, but it's useful to hear that perspective, right? So to my mind, quite frankly, the most immediate security threat that Pakistan faces right now is not coming from the East, it's coming from the West.
Financed and directed from the East.
Well, depends on perspective as well.
Sure.
I think this is one of those places where you look at the shift that Pakistan attempted to make, arguably is still making, you tell me, from recognizing that so much of its influence, its power, its ability to project itself in the world is based on economics today. And the move towards geoeconomics, yes, it can be dismissed as a buzzword, but I think that is really meaningful. And I think we have seen the extent to which private sector investment being able to stand on one's own 2 feet and not have to worry about the IMF or the World Bank or whatever, this next infusion is coming from. Far be it for me to say what, Pakistan should or shouldn't do, but I have to imagine that if I were in those shoes and looking at my options and looking at what was constraining them, that's a pretty significant one. And so if I start for solving for what at this time of great uncertainty, right, is going to give me the most flexibility, is going to best allow me to maintain my options while we see which way things are headed. It's going to be doubling down on investing in the things that is going to make me less dependent.
Sure.
Right? And I think, there's plenty of ways to debate guns and butter. But solving for that vulnerability feels so much more acute to me and in my analysis of the situation than responding only directly through kind of a very security-focused lens to this rhetoric, right? There's going to be rhetoric, but I have to say too, never say never, certainly, but the fact that the ceasefire has held since 2021, yes, there have been blips. Yes, we see reports. Yes, there are an increase in attacks in Jammu lately. But nonetheless, that is a space where I think we have to recognize that. And I certainly am glad to see that that has maintained over the course of now nearly 4 years, right?
Yeah.
There are some bright spots there.
Well, I think bright spots that are entirely of Pakistan's making. Pakistan's response to Balakot, whilst, the US and Australia and Germany and France and the UK rushed to congratulate and endorse India's unprovoked attack on Pakistani territory, Pakistan responded in a way that diffused the temperature and the situation. I guess what I'm asking for is I'd like a little bit more of a pat on the back from the whole world instead of kind of responding to this effort by saying do more, which seems to be the only thing that, the world wants to say to Pakistan. Am I being too sort of abrasive in asking for that?
I think a couple thoughts come to mind, right? So I was particularly relieved to see the restrained approach that Pakistan took in the spring of 2022 when we saw the accidental missile launch from India into Pakistan. And I think part of the lack of attention that got was in fact because of what was happening on the other side of the world. That was immediately in the aftermath of the Ukraine invasion. But that certainly was noticed. And it was also just a good thing that it was a time of, not crisis, relative calm in the relationship, that there wasn't much of a risk of misinterpretation, for example. But it was very concerning that, at least based on the open source we've seen, communication channels weren't used, the systems and the practices, the norms that have built up over the years weren't called into effect at a time where they should have been. And Pakistan didn't respond, and I think that was noticed. More broadly, I hear the frustration from Pakistan that, Pakistan doesn't want to be sidelined. Pakistan doesn't want to be ignored. And to an extent, looking across the border at this asymmetry in the relationship, which is growing. And that puts a real pressure on stability in the region, on relationships in the region. That's a difficult thing to handle, right? That's a difficult thing to navigate.
What historically, just from, because you're a scholar and you've done deep research, much more than I have. Historically, what ends up happening when that asymmetry grows beyond a certain point? What are the incentives for the smaller actor after the asymmetry reaches a point of no return and other actors are not engaged in a meaningful way? Historically, I'm genuinely asking, what ends up happening to smaller actors?
Yeah.
Like, how does their behavior change?
So this won't surprise you. It's contextually specific, right? And in this particular context, there's a lot of weight of history that I think particularly impacts this relationship, and the fact that both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers, right? And so I've tried to kind of think about this question in the past as we project, 10, 20 years in the future. How long is this sustainable in its current state? Because it feels like I was saying that there are really significant pressures within the region, but also extra-regionally that are having impacts. I haven't been able to come up with that analogous relationship where it is a dyad, it is a frozen conflict, it is one that is changing and being shaped, but also one where there is, at least in terms of nuclear weapons capabilities, relative parity on both sides, right? And I think that that brings this relationship into a different level of focus that makes it very difficult to apply some of those lessons from the outside. I'm curious if you have any analogs, right? Because we can look around South Asia and see how smaller South Asian states have managed their relationship with India over time. And that's something, but it's quite different in this context for a host of factors. So, I think we would probably be better placed as analysts if there were something we could look to in mind as a way out of this. This is not from history, but just my own sense of this is particularly in this current moment where so much is at flux, it feels like, right? Bigger picture wise. I would hope that this is a time when, I'm not holding my breath for a major breakthrough, but if nothing else, if we can maintain what we've seen over the past several years, right? If this can just not be one of those places in the world, if the line of control can stay calm, there are enough other issues going on right now. And I think that is, quite frankly, kind of enough to aim for, as both sides, to an extent, have their hands full with situations on other borders.
The question of Gilgit-Baltistan, the question of Kashmir, the question of Balochistan, the question of the Durand Line, these are all not questions for Pakistan. They are Pakistan. And so when somebody asks us to kind of ignore the rhetoric from New Delhi, well, we have ignored it. What's the advice from DC today?
I have the opportunity to go to Delhi fairly regularly, and I've started keeping track of the number of times that various countries in the region come up in conversation if I don't push things in a certain direction. And it has been remarkable, even just over the course of, the decade or so that I've been doing this, that how dramatically the shift has happened to look to Beijing, to look at China. There are many here who see that more as window dressing, more as an effort to derive benefits and get security assistance from the US, sure. But to the extent that it passes the sniff test for me, I think there are genuine concerns there in New Delhi about Chinese intentions, about what happened along the line of actual control, and that there is, even if that rhetoric keeps up around Pakistan, even if it's there because it carries weight domestically, of course, it's a deeply felt feeling. But I think what happened in June of 2020 was really a transformative moment in a lot of ways in that calculation of kind of security threat perceptions. And even though we've seen the disengagement deal, I was kind of curious how this would play, whether this would allow for a shift back to more of a focus on Pakistan. It's not what at least I picked up on so far. There's still tens of thousands of troops on both sides of the LAC, and this looks likely to be something that is going to continue into the future. Where things get complicated, of course, and I think where colleagues in Delhi err in judgment is to the extent that they read China and Pakistan as absolutely hand in glove, right? That there is no daylight, no distance between the two. Maybe down the road it's possible that we're heading to a situation that looks more like that. I don't know. But that removes space for any sort of dialogue with Pakistan on a bilateral basis about the issues that matter to the two sides and aren't tied up in this broader geopolitical equation, right? And so coming back to your question here from Pakistan's standpoint, I think recognizing that, sometimes I hear from the Pakistani side that Similarly, there's a perception that everything that India is doing, everything India is acquiring, is Pakistan focused versus China focused. Of course, we have to look at capabilities and not intent, and these things get really complicated. But what I hear in both of those sides is, to be honest, going back to what you were saying, a need to sit down at the table and have meaningful conversations about difficult topics with each other. And I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's what I got.
Zaidi's, our tribe has a long history, and getting what we want is rarely the thing. But we are perturbed as a people, I think, by hearing things that don't align with our perception of the facts. And I'm trying to be as, because we go back such a long way, so I'm careful that I don't want to offend you.
Yes.
But 36 French planes, they're called Rafales, 24 targeted to Pakistan, 5 batteries of S-400s that the U.S. sanctioned. Russia is the evilest thing that ever existed, but when India needs S-400s, go ahead, buddy, no problem. Iran is evil empire, but if, India needs something from Iran, go ahead, no problem. Russian oil is haram. Wallah, Maulana America said it's haram, but for India it's halal. It's kosher. Let me frame the question this way. 5 years from now, the person in your role, are they going to be the head of the South Asia program, or are they going to be head of the Indo-Pacific program?
I want to ask what you actually mean by that nuance. So what is the difference for you between South Asia and Indo-Pacific as you ask that question? Because I want to make sure I answer it.
Well, if I tell you my intentions, then you won't answer it. So clever. But let me be transparent. Sure. I think that a South Asia program is about understanding the countries of South Asia and, as it stands right now, how they will accept Indian hegemony. Yeah. I think that the American project in this region is get everybody to accept Indian hegemony. And Pakistan's problem is it won't do it. And now you've got Bangladesh as a problem. And frankly, even Sri Lanka doesn't accept it. I think Nepal is a problem for India. But, Nepal is too small in comparison with some of the other countries. That's the project today. I think the Indo-Pacific project is about not worrying about Indian hegemony and getting India to materially line up with aggressive intentions in the South China Sea. Americans aren't affected by India's behavior, but Pakistan's existence is shaped by India's behavior. That's how big India is, but also that's how not small Pakistan is. So I don't know if I answered your question, but...
No, I think, it's an interesting one. I had written, I guess back in November, so pretty soon after the election, Stimson does kind of a presidential inbox series where we're asked to write a memo to the incoming administration. And mine was a call to bring back the South Asia strategy, which we had in the first Trump administration. It was a little bit tongue-in-cheek because the South Asia strategy from the first Trump administration was all Afghanistan, articulated in a speech that Trump gave in 2017. And then there was the Indo-Pacific strategy, and we got the public-facing version. And
all Afghanistan on India's shoulders.
Well, yeah, the only time that India came up was in the context of Afghanistan and then briefly on nuclear risk between India and Pakistan. That was it. Separately, there was the Indo-Pacific strategy, right, in which it's peer competitor China and leveraging ties. We got the public-facing version, and then just before the Trump administration left office, they declassified the longer version. And so the argument that I make in this piece is part of the challenge of seeing the region through the Indo-Pacific lens is that China is the frame, right? That is definitionally what so much of the focus is about and concern about what's perceived in the US as being Chinese aggressive behavior and how we're going to meet that. So what that doesn't do, though, is allow flexibility to think about other US priorities in the region. Things like counterterrorism, things like nuclear risk. Like, these are really live issues that, to my mind, are not always in alignment with what the Indo-Pacific strategy version of US policy is. It also doesn't really recognize, one of the challenges with the region and one of the discomforts here is India's role has grown enormously outside of South Asia as well. And so I think there is a little bit of a policy challenge in figuring out how best to grapple with that.
How have the corporates done it? Because the corporates have basically set up a separate India office, and then they have the regional office in which they bunch together countries weirdly around India sometimes to the east, sometimes
Always
to the
terrible
west.
acronyms. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I think everybody's kind of trying to figure out how to get their arms around this issue. But to your point, right, like it's not all smooth sailing. We saw the Bangladesh issue. We've seen some of the challenges in other states where they do perceive India as a country with whom they have quite a bit of baggage from history. And so I think I will be curious looking ahead to the new administration, how the administration balances what is perceived to be U.S. bilateral interests with these countries and that broader relationship with India in the Indo-Pacific context. Because we, sitting in Washington, think about kind of US-China competition, and that's the two poles that countries are trying to balance against. But in South Asia, we have to think about India too. And sometimes that's kind of a trilateral balancing act, which is even more challenging for these smaller South Asian states.
Let me sort of, be, I don't think necessarily faux provocative, but you may be provoked by this. And again, I don't mean any offense by this. To what extent do you think that may be at least partly true, that India's influence in DC has grown to the extent that you can't really, especially with Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, I don't think these countries can expect a fair conversation. And actually, I don't expect one in DC. Like, I believe that the scale is badly out of whack and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Do you think that's too cynical and pessimistic?
I do.
Okay.
It depends what your definition of fair is, right? And these are people working from interests, but, I would push back on the perception of a monolithic conversation. There are constantly interesting conversations that are happening, some in public, some in private. Just look at how the policy conversation as this administration comes to office, right? We haven't talked about the Modi visit. Like, he was just in DC and thinking through some of the pressure that is being exerted on India in ways that we hadn't seen in the past administration, right? Like real serious conversations about tariffs and trade and protectionism and some of the other concerns that are coming out of the White House. That says to me that this is a space where certainly it is a major defense partnership and we're moving into a space of cooperation, and I expect that to continue. But there is room for differences of opinion.
I would push back and say, look, a MAGA-driven kind of push on Modi, on BRICS being dead, and on tariffs doesn't I don't think my friends in D.C. get to claim that as a win for objectivity, because the burden of responsibility in terms of a balanced strategic view from D.C. there's no balance. I know that these are things that are hard to kind of objectively metric, but there is definitely, if I was comparing this era to 15 years ago, a vast difference in the kinds of topics that we see covered in the relationship. And of course, the legitimate and correct answer would be that that's because the circumstances have changed.
Of course, the world has changed in 17 years.
But I do think that the oppression of the Kashmiris hasn't changed. Pakistan and India both being nuclear powers hasn't changed. Kashmir is a UN Security Council verified and endorsed, issue that, and beyond issue, but I'm trying to use the least provocative language, challenges to India's unilateral and unfettered access to Washingtonian warmth is really what I was looking for. And correct me if I've heard you incorrectly, but I didn't hear that there are any.
I would push back on the personalistic side of things. I think there are certainly differences of policy opinion, but tying that immediately to the people who are making those decisions, I think that's where I would respectfully disagree, because we've seen over time, this has been something we've seen. The U.S. has a very vibrant and strong Indian diaspora, but also a Pakistani diaspora. And so I do think there is space and a need for an intentional open conversation in DC, but also it's not just about DC, right? Like we started this conversation with your very kind words about our program and the investments we make in those voices here in the region. And so I think what I would come back to and how I try to wayfind in this space is to create those opportunities for that critical discourse within the region itself, and particularly among rising analysts. Because, I sit in DC, I come out to the region as often as I can, but I'm not based here, right? I have fundamentally a different perspective and different stake in that. And so to the extent that we can create a platform that is open to all comers, like that's as close as I have come to being able to find a way to make sure that we are using the space that we occupy in DC for giving space to those voices as well.
I think you already know this, but let me wrap up. Well, there you have it. The U.S. Is going to be what it's going to be. I think there's a real change in the realities around how the U.S. looks at the world. But the one constant, I think, is likely going to remain India, and that has serious implications for Pakistan. We discussed some of that today with Elizabeth, and we'll keep doing it with other friends, inshallah. Keep learning about each other and keep trying to make the world a better place. Until next time, inshallah, see you. Khuda Hafiz.